Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Shaping Mobility webinars. Today we will be speaking about the global cycling momentum and how to keep the wheels running in cities all over the world. My name is Sagi Or and I am a Marketing and Communication Director at PTV Group. PTV Group, for those who don't know it yet, is a global developer of mobility software, and that includes supporting cities who are transferring to bicycle-friendly infrastructure. Which is actually quite nice because PTV is located in Karlsruhe in Germany, which is the birth city of Karl von Drais, who in 1817 invented the first prototype of the bicycle. Before we start, a few housekeeping notes. If you encounter any problems with the audio, so please log out and then log in again. It usually solves the problem. If you have any questions during the webinar, so please type them in the question box that you can find on the right hand of the screen, and we will try to answer them at the end of this webinar. And for those of you who cannot attend the entire length of the webinar, so please don't worry, we will send a recording to anyone who registered to this webinar. So I would like to present our wonderful guests today. From Wellington in New Zealand joins us Julie Anne Genter, who is the Associate Minister for Transport for the New Zealand government and is also the Minister for Women and the Associate Minister for Health. Julie Anne is a former transport consultant herself and is an AVIC bike user who in 2018 made world headlines because she chose to bike to the hospital to give birth to her son. Welcome, Julie Anne. From Amsterdam joins us George Liu, who is the Executive Director of the Urban Cycling Institute at the University of Amsterdam. George's research focuses on how attractive urban design can contribute to better cycling conditions and is also focusing on cycle highways. Besides his academic work, George also co-produced the world's first online cycling webinar. From Munich here in Germany joins us Kaths, who is a bicycle traffic researcher at the Technical University of Munich. And Heather's research focuses on the behavior of road users and in specific bicycle users, and also about urban traffic safety and efficiency. Welcome, Heather. Last but not least, from Paris joins us Phillippe Crist, who is the advisor for innovation and foresight at the International Transport Forum, which is a subdivision of the OECD in Paris. Phillippe is a recognized world expert on cycling safety and policy. And if anyone was in doubt, he is also a former competitive cyclist himself. Thank you, Phillippe, for coming. I would like to start the discussion by highlighting that the last few months we have all witnessed a really impressive surge in bicycle usage in cities all around the world, which is something that we have never seen in this something like this ever before. Due to the corona pandemic, a lot of cities installed temporary or pop-up bicycle lanes, while other cities have chosen to put in place more permanent measures. And what we have also seen, which I think is quite unique, is a sudden promise from elected officials and elected governments that from now on there would be given more attention to bicycle, and there would be more space in our streets and our roads for bicycle use. So maybe to start the conversation, I would like to ask each of our guests, why is this coronavirus crisis so special and unique for bicycle use than anything we have seen before, not only from the perspective of the bicycle users themselves, but also from the angle of the official reaction to it. So Julie Anne, perhaps as a representative of a government, we should start with you.
Good day, everyone, or good evening, as it is here in New Zealand. But I think, firstly, the global pandemic is global, and we're quite interconnected, much more so than we were in previous times when there's been a global pandemic. And so we're able to share information, share videos, share photographs, and be in contact just as we are right now. And I think that cycling was already gaining momentum in a number of cities. With the sudden need to socially distance to protect yourself from catching the coronavirus from someone else, public transport became less attractive. There was less traffic on the streets because most people have been asked to stay at home. And in some cases, there's less industry, so fewer heavy vehicle movements. And suddenly the streets were wide open and clear, and people could get on their bikes and feel safe to do so. And that became a very efficient and attractive way of moving around. Certainly, we wanted to support cycling because we could see, particularly in those areas where public transport normally carried a lot of people, that wasn't going to be an option for a while. And it was a great opportunity for people to get some exercise, which helps them stay mentally happy at a time that is otherwise very stressful. We know how important exercise is for mental and physical health. So in New Zealand, we went into a lockdown in the end of March. And we had about 7 weeks of a fairly extreme lockdown where people were encouraged to stay close to home unless they were an essential worker. In fact, they were required to stay at home. And during that time, we saw many more people getting out, walking and cycling. And there was, I think, more than an 80% reduction in traffic in our cities. And people really noticed the quiet, and they really noticed that they felt free to get out and take the car lanes and move around. So we saw families. We're in a kind of a unique situation, which I might talk about a bit later, where our lockdown was so effective that we've, for the moment anyway, effectively eliminated COVID-19. And so that means just starting this week, we've gone back to life as normal. And sadly, with that has come the traffic and even people's comfort taking public transport, which is a good thing. But I think that we will still have that opportunity to make more progress on cycle lanes because people have that memory of how nice it was to be able to get out and cycle with their families, and they remember how nice it was to not have streets totally dominated by car traffic. But we probably won't have made quite as much progress specifically for the reason of maintaining physical distance that some other cities did, which we were intending when we thought we might have that requirement to socially distance for an extended period of time.
Thank you. Heather, what's your view on the special circumstances of this crisis or pandemic, actually?
Thank you, first of all, for the invitation here. And Julie Anne already covered a lot of points that are somehow very similar here in Germany as they are in New Zealand. What happened here is that we were told to stay home pretty suddenly on March 13th, I think it was. And from that point on, public transport was pretty much a no-no. They said, or people felt it was dangerous, it was not safe, you could get sick there. And at the same time, they also said, please stay at home. Please don't go out, only if necessary, don't go to work, stay home. And so the situation on the streets changed overnight almost, where you would see buses driving by that were almost empty, trams, the same thing, 1 or 2 people that had to be on them, very few cars, very few trucks, a few of them, of course, that had to go, but the streets were basically empty. It was very quiet. People were very relaxed. The situation was suddenly completely different, and people thought, "Wow, you know what? I could bike to the store. I could leave my car at home for the next few weeks and just enjoy the quiet or keep the quiet for other people." And so that was kind of on a personal level that people said, "How do we want our cities to be? What do we want our lives to be like? How do we want to get around?" And they could hear the birds. I've heard that so many times that people could suddenly hear birds. And that we missed that for so long, and finally it came out as kind of a big thing. So that was kind of the background of the opportunity that we had. What I really noticed here in Munich was also an international movement, or a movement everywhere. First, the city of Munich, or the city council, was really reluctant to have bicycle pop-up lanes. They said, no, this is activism, this is too much too fast, this is just for a short time, we're going to go back to normal soon, anytime now. And then they saw Milan doing something, they saw Barcelona, they saw Paris, and then they saw Berlin and Hamburg, and they thought, at least this is my opinion, we better do something too. This is a thing, this is coming, this is a big movement. We can't just leave our bicyclists high and dry in Munich either. And now they're doing a few things, not as much as other cities maybe, but we're gonna have 8 bike pop-up lanes. Maybe it doesn't sound like a lot, but it was definitely more that was planned originally. And I think that's good. I think it's hopefully supporting that the people who were taking public transport are now going to think about taking their bike, and they're not going to think about taking their car, or they're going to keep not taking their car. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Phillippe, same question to you, please.
Yeah, well, at the International Transport Forum, we've been looking across our membership, both at the national level and at the city level, to try to understand in what way public authorities have reacted to the constraints that Julie Anne and Heather have talked about. I want to say that the situation, of course, around the world is very different. There are some regions of the world that are just entering now the ramp up to the peak of their pandemic, especially in Latin America and South America. And there are other places where the plateau of the pandemic is still quite present. And that includes even many regions in Europe that have already loosened their lockdown. And it's certainly the case in North America with the United States. And so there are all different situations in terms of how comfortable people feel getting around, how they assess the risk of potentially being infected. And this plays into the way in which this pop-up infrastructure and these networks will have or will not have long-term effects. So what we can see is, just like what Julie Anne was saying, a lot of coavoidance behavior. So people avoiding public transport because they felt it wasn't safe. In some cases, they were prevented, told not to use public transport. Some cities actively discouraged the use of public transport. The physical distancing requirements, I think, will probably evolve over time. And we've seen countries like in Japan and Taiwan where the physical distancing requirements have been relaxed as other measures to prevent the spread of the virus have been put into place. But the coavoidance, the fear of public transport, that is something that will lag and perhaps last much longer, especially in situations unlike in New Zealand, where the threat is still latent. So there is a need to absorb that displaced traffic. And what we have seen is there have been some regions where that displaced traffic, of course, has been absorbed by telework. But there's still a lot of travel that needs to take place. And we've seen a shift to car travel. In most large urban areas, the scale of avoided trips simply cannot be absorbed on streets in cars. It is a physical impossibility. And this is why a lot of councils, a lot of public authorities very quickly realized they had to rectify a situation, which was the poor allocation of space to this new situation. And so that's what we've seen. A lot of cities, like what we've heard from New Zealand, like what we've heard from Germany, more than, right now at our last count, more than 1,800 cities that we're aware of have put in place either pop-up infrastructure or entire networks to absorb this traffic. And there are 2 points to remember here. The first is that in the city centers, cities are not designed for physical spacing. In fact, they're designed to benefit from the opposite of physical spacing, which is cramming a lot of people together. And so that imperative means that not only do you need to allocate space for people to move around quickly from one part of the city to the other, so that would be light individual transport infrastructure that can be used by cyclists, but can also be used by e-scooterists, by other light mobility devices. But there has to be some space allocated for walking and queuing. And so this dual imperative, how do we provide more space for people walking in this environment? How do we provide more space for people traveling through this environment without using public transport or cars, has put cities in a predicament where they've had to reassess how much space do we give of our dense urban city to different uses. That, I think, is a really interesting development, because before, cities typically had not been thinking about space allocation in this way. What is the most resilient form of space allocation for our cities? So I would say that's one big takeaway right now, is that cities are starting to think about this. That extends beyond COVID, because I think we can say that there's been a fairly inefficient allocation of space in dense urban areas, not everywhere, but in dense urban areas. And to have this discussion start to be prompted in city councils is, I think, a good thing. The other thing I want to make that we've seen is that there's a distinction between emergency and temporary. And so a lot of people have been talking, and they're right, they're talking about tactical urbanism, and this is a way of advancing very quickly on certain things and in certain desired results. But tactical urbanism isn't about temporary changes. Tactical urbanism is about making long-term changes quickly. And I think there are cities that have realized that, and those cities are looking at what do they have in their back pocket already in terms of network plans for light individual transport networks. What do they have already on the books? And they're thinking, well, how then can we fast track that? And so cities like Lima, that has put in place almost overnight 301 kilometers of bikeways. Cities like, or regions like the Ile-de-France region in Paris and the surrounding region, 650 kilometers of bikeways. These are plans that existed. The fact that they can now do this more rapidly as a result of the pressures that I've described, but the plans are there. And the reason they're doing this, and this is the second takeaway, is that they really want to build now what they can use in the future and what they can make, what would help make those cities more resilient, not just to the pandemic, but also to strikes or other kinds of perturbations in daily life that we face. So those are some of the lessons that we're seeing from around the world when we look at this. And I think, of course, not every city is taking that pathway, but many cities are. And the ones that are going to come out of this better off, I think, are the ones that are taking this more strategic approach.
Thank you. So, George, same question to you. What is so special about the current crisis?
Yeah, actually, this is a great opportunity at the Urban Cycling Institute and researchers around the world to see this as a huge natural experiment. And I think what we're trying to get a handle on is making sure that we're keeping track of this, that this experiment that's happening naturally is being captured, and that later when we have a bit more time and our heads are out of this emergency situation, that we're able to analyze the data and to see exactly what the effects are. From tactical urbanism measures, from these more permanent measures, from these changes induced by the environment. And then if we're able to make more recommendations to policymakers based on solid data, saying, hey, this is something that really worked during the pandemic. This could be something that we could continue going forward. And this is by the numbers exactly how much better things are now compared to before. And here are the changes. I think that would go a long way to making some of these discussions and these changes much more permanent, other than just seeing that, wow, this has worked during the pandemic. So the second point I want to make is a follow-up to the reaction by the Assistant Minister of Transport of New Zealand, in that people have realized that cities are much quieter, that there's all of these qualitative changes related to their street, to their neighborhood, that's actually not very easily captured by the numbers, right? Like, what's the value of hearing birds? What's the value of hearing children play on the street? And these are the real measures of the quality of our street, right? If you think about quality of an urban environment. And my work on measuring the experience of cycling also ties into the pedestrian experience and the overall experience of people walking around within their neighborhoods, is to ask these questions. Okay, the traffic has gone down. That's wonderful. Potentially the number of traffic accidents have also gone down with it. But what does that mean for an increased quality of life and the increased quality of the neighborhoods that we all live and work and play in? And finally, I want to talk a bit about this distinction between short-range transport and long-range transport. So here at the Urban Cycling Institute, we've been doing a series of research on the bike train commuter system, and the part of the advantages of using trains and bus rapid transit for long distance commuting is that at short ranges, we can see cycling and local transport competing against each other. Right, we know that in urban environments, cycling is actually incredibly fast compared to cars stuck in congestion, and compared to buses and transport that have to make a lot of stops. But at these longer ranges, it's where we see people parking their bikes at the train station, hopping on a regional train, and then heading to another city, 50, 60 kilometers away. What do we do about those trips that the train or public transport or cycling cannot directly replace? right? And what do we do about the decreased capacity of the train system in these ranges where cycling is not yet quite viable, right? So before we looked at bicycle highways in terms of complementary to the train as well as being supplementary. But now we're moving to a situation where we're asking cyclists to further extend the range, of their travel. So what used to be a bicycle train trip potentially can now need to take place on a bike alone. And what does that mean for electric mobility? What does that mean for faster e-bikes? And what does that mean for the need for long-range bicycle infrastructure? Those are all very open questions for us.
Thank you. I think all of you mentioned the importance of changes to the infrastructure. So perhaps I'd like to ask you, George, the next question. These things cost money, and often in developing countries or even in medium income economies, these are things that are quite difficult to implement for lack of resources. How can we address this challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. Even for high quality bicycle infrastructure, we're still looking at about €1 million, dollars per kilometer of infrastructure. And when you get into bridges and tunnels, it gets to be quite expensive. So I think what's key here is to look at the relative cost of bicycle infrastructure. And in fact, if we're talking about urban road space, which is most of where cycling happens, we're actually looking at not the money cost being the biggest barrier, but the political cost of trying to reallocate space. And politicians feel this more heavily than anyone else when it comes to trying to convince the public that indeed this is a good way to go. So there's a monetary component of paving the asphalt, which is something like $1 million per kilometer. But the bigger struggle, I think, around the world is the time and the resources needed to convince people that allocating the space in the first place is the thing to do. And on that front, money can't really help much there. It is about building a movement. It is about building political consensus and trying to convince people, as perhaps this pandemic has done, of the political and social value of seeing more bike and pedestrian infrastructure.
So you've mentioned yes, Philip?
I just want to add something on the cost, because we're talking about two levels of infrastructure, or many levels of infrastructure, but there is the kind of infrastructure that you want in your region to last for a long time, and this is the permanent, separated, well-demarcated infrastructure. That's not what we're seeing rolled out right now, and hopefully it is a precursor to that. But the cost of rolling out what a lot of cities, even those cities that have long-term plans, is much lower even than the kind of infrastructure that is permanent. And really, it's using construction materials and the rules relating to construction diversion to build these temporary spaces. That cost, in terms of the capital cost, is quite low. What isn't low is the cost of policing and maintaining that, because these are light infrastructure items. Cities have had to allocate more resources to maintaining, replacing bollards, plastic bollards, and making sure that that space is protected from parking vehicles. So in the immediate, the capital costs are low, the maintenance and policing costs are high, and those sometimes come from different budgets. And so that's just something to keep in mind. And I'd just like to add something to what George was saying. We know both especially for this kind of very rapid rollout of infrastructure, when it leads to changes in travel behavior or travel usage, and especially the longer term, the return on investment for this infrastructure is incredibly high, and orders of magnitude higher than similar investments for road infrastructure where there's already a lot of road infrastructure. So this kind of spend actually makes a lot of sense for an entire economy, especially in an urban economy, not just because it provides more mobility, it also provides more opportunities for local commerce, because many of the people who are using the shops are actually not driving to shops in dense urban areas, they're taking public transport, they're walking, they're cycling, or they're scootering. So the ROI, the return on investment, is something that is worth pointing out, because this is not something that typically comes into some of these decisions at the outset. But when you do proper appraisal and proper assessment of these, then it should come out that these are actually really good investments.
We are, I think, really pointing out to an important aspect of it, that there is a social and political angles to the adaptation of bicycle-friendly measures. So I would like perhaps to ask Julie Anne, what is and what was the public reaction when you implemented these new measures? Was there any negative reaction, which some people are calling a backlash?
Well, just to explain quickly what we did. Our local government, our city councils, co-fund most transport infrastructure with the central government. And so at the central government level, our New Zealand Transport Agency had been working on a fund that would be a contestable fund for tactical urbanism. And that was pre-COVID. And it was all geared up and ready to be announced right when COVID-19 was really hitting us, and we were realizing we had to change things quite quickly. And so I made the case that we should announce the fund, but also extend it to city councils to say, if you want to use this, it has a higher subsidy rate. So normally city councils might pay 50% of a bike lane. We said we'll pay 90% of these tactical urbanism projects, and you can use them immediately if you want to roll out some urgent pop-up bike lanes to deal with the need to physically distance. But because we went into the level 4 lockdown, I think I announced it when we were in our highest level of lockdown, we couldn't do anything besides emergency works. And so they couldn't go out and roll out the bike lanes during that lockdown. It was more in the next stage when we went down a level and normal infrastructure improvements started to be made. But a few councils did roll it out, and it was extremely popular amongst people who were using it. And then there was also a few people who were extremely unhappy about it and said it was bike lanes by stealth, and this is ridiculous, and why would you do this? But I'd say the vast majority of people who were using the streets found it really useful. This included sort of extensions of the footpath, and pop-up cycle lanes in areas where there was a lot of competition on a shared path between pedestrians and people on bicycles, and then also extending the space in front of very crowded bus stops, so where people were still using public transport. We also made our public transport free during our lockdown, but you were only allowed to use it if you were an essential worker or you were using it to go to the supermarket or some sort of essential trip. So
I have to say I was there during the lockdown, so it really touches base for me. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh wow, yeah. So the thing that's happened for us is that one city council wanted to go for the funds for the COVID related. So the majority of the city councils that applied for projects, for tactical urbanism projects, didn't have a specific COVID-19 response. There were some, but the majority just went for projects they wanted to do anyway. And one city council went for the COVID-19 fund, but decided that they wanted to take a more traditional, longer process for consultation, which meant that they didn't roll it out when we were in level 3 and about to go down to level 2. And so now that we're no longer need to be socially distanced, as they say here, or physically distanced, they no longer have the reason why they consulted on these projects. And I would say that there's just overwhelming disappointment because the projects had 2/3 support from the community, and that was before they were implemented. And typically these sorts of projects, once they're implemented, the support increases. So, I think it's fraught everywhere, and it's amusing to me to hear from people in European countries, which I would consider to be very advanced compared to New Zealand in terms of cycling infrastructure, that they still have the same reluctance as Heather was saying, for example, in Munich, because that's, I guess that's true everywhere where there will be city officials or local body politicians who will be very sensitive to any sort of criticism of a change of the street layout. That overwhelming belief that a few car parks on the street are essential to a particular cafe or a shop, when really they're probably overestimating the importance of that car park. And the only way to change it is really to say, look, we're going to have to change it and see how it goes. And that's why I've been a big proponent of tactical urbanism, because I felt it would give us the opportunity to trial things and let people see how it's different and what happens, and then make more permanent changes based on the feedback you get during the trial. So I'm still hopeful that there's actually overwhelming support for these sorts of changes, that the period of time in which we all had to stay at home and people went out and enjoyed the streets and the quiet gave a brief window into what our cities could be like if we focused on walking and cycling for more short trips and reduced the amount of car traffic by doing that. But I think there will always be this barrier in terms of it's always easier to stay with the status quo than to make a change. And so, we'll just have to keep carrying on. And I, from a central government level, can provide that message of support, but ultimately it will be down, and I can provide additional funding, hopefully, but it's up to local councils to really have the courage to lead on this. And when you have, 2/3 majority supporting something, you don't stop just because some people are very unhappy about it. You have to say, actually, the majority of the people want and know that it's a fundamental human right to be able to get around your city, and a 12-year-old child should be able to be independent and cycle safely. And let's figure out the parking after we've got that basic infrastructure, and so all of our 12-year-olds can be independent and safe.
So because this is basically about changing people's habits, so perhaps the next question is for you, Heather, because your research focuses on behavior of road users. When we want to engage more people in biking, do you think that there are certain road users that we should target more than the others, sort of car users or public transport users? Who is more likely to convert into biking when necessary?
Well, the first people that we were thinking about here in the pandemic is the public transport users, or the people who were using public transport, just because they're afraid to use it, or they have been afraid to use it, or don't want to in fear of getting COVID-19. So let's think about those people for a minute. A lot of them are or were captive public transport users. So those are people who didn't have another choice, or perceived that they didn't have another choice. They thought, okay, I only have my bus, I only have my tram, I'm going to have to take this. So let's focus on showing those people that the bike can be another option for them. So show that we don't just have regular bikes that can go for 2, 3, 4, 5 kilometers, but e-bikes are an option. There's bicycle highways that make riding longer distance pretty comfortable, pretty enjoyable, especially if you can hear those birds singing outside. So we need to publish it or make it a little more accessible for these people who are suddenly kicked away off their bus, off their tram, off their S-Bahn. When we think about the car drivers, it's a little bit more difficult. I'm not sure that people who are using their cars or have been using their cars regularly every day for their commutes, for their shopping, if they're going to see the opportunity now during COVID to switch to the bicycle. But what we can think about, or what we always do think about and can think about a little bit more here, is push and pull measures. So the push measures are the measures that push people out of their cars. And now, for example, in Munich, what we're seeing is a lot of street closures for roadworks. Also, that they're taking the time, okay, let's rip up our streets now, we have the option, and it makes driving in the city really uncomfortable. I don't know if it's really for a push measure, but it's the result of what's happened. But then we see these bike lanes coming, pedestrian areas closing, and driving in the city, or at least in urban areas here, is becoming much less enjoyable, less fast, takes a lot longer to get anywhere. And all these things together can get the people out of their cars and looking for something else to use. But what we need at the same time as we're pushing them out is a pull measure towards the bicycle. So how can we make this mode of transport more attractive, more visible, more usable for many different people? What we have here in Germany, I think maybe in a lot of other places too, is a rush on buying bikes. So there's people going out, they're wanting to buy e-bikes. It's impossible to try to, or not impossible, but we have a huge waiting list if you want to buy anything new. And I think a lot of people are thinking about that for sport. They want to go mountain biking or road biking. They want to do something for physical activity. But maybe the first idea that they have is not, oh, I could also use my bike to drive to the grocery store or go to work when it opens up again. And maybe we need to take some time or some effort to plant those seeds in people's heads to say, okay, come on, this is not just a fun thing to do, or it is a fun thing to do, but it could also be fun when you're just going shopping or you're just going to work. So kind of trying to change the mindset there. I know I'm from Canada and I didn't even have the idea that you could travel with a bike until until I almost moved to Europe. So planting that seed is definitely an important step in getting all types of people, but especially the people who are using another mode of transport to switch to the bicycle. One more thing that I want to say for me from a personal point of view, I ride my bike, I love biking, but I'm a fair weather biker. I like to do it when the sun is shining and my son can sit on the back and not complain that it's rainy or windy. And what I'm really learning in this time is that it's also possible when it's raining. I mean, we just need to buy some better rain gear. But maybe making this information possible or making it a little bit more normal. I think there are countries, European countries, that it is normal to cycle in all sorts of weathers, or normal to cycle in all sorts of weathers, and other places where it's not. But maybe changing the social norms and acceptance of what people will want to do. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say.
So you've mentioned the weather. So Phillippe, I actually would like to ask you the next question. Is switching to bicycle relevant and can be implemented in every community, or perhaps there are cities and places where the geography, the weather, perhaps the size of the family it's not applicable for them. So how should the city or a community know if and which measures to take to encourage people to switch to bicycle? You're muted. Phillippe, you're muted.
Short answer to your question is yes, and I'd like to get back to that. I just want to touch on two things that Heather said before I do that. When we talk about attracting public transport users, this is anecdotal, but in Paris, they have developed a lot of the new infrastructure specifically to double public transport lines, and they're identified as surface public transport lines. So there's a bit of branding there. The regional bicycle network is branded like the regional train network, and it provides a signal to those that use public transport. Oh, I usually take Metro Line 1, I'll take Surface Line 1 or Bike Route 1. I usually take the RER-A, which is the fast regional train. I'll take Bike Route A. And so that's one thing. The second thing, when we look at urban regions, larger urban regions, there are, when we think about car use, there's a difference between inhabitants of the core, of the densest part of the region, and the users of those spaces. The inhabitants tend to not use the cars at all, or very little in these areas, about 30 to 40%, or sorry, in Paris, for example, 65% of people in the center of Paris don't even own a car. Most of the cars and vans on the street are coming from outside. And so there's a different population. You can find a lot of traction selling light infrastructure and cycling and more walking to inhabitants, but they're not the ones causing the traffic. And the behavior that you're looking to change is often outside this core. And that's just, again, something to think about when you're looking at different populations that you want to address. All right, so will rain, will hills, will culture mean that certain regions and certain populations will not be able to cycle, or there limits the possibility to bicycle? No, there is no gene for walking more or for cycling more. In fact, if anything, there is a gene that we have, and that is the way in which humans are made up, that we are made to benefit from activity, from physical activity. We're made to move. And in fact, you can argue that the one thing we can say in terms of the genetic makeup of humans is that less movement is bad. So, but it doesn't have anything to do with cycling or walking or anything of that nature. A lot of it has to do with the conditions in which these activities can happen. I'll give an example again from Paris because this is what I can see, is that the rollout of better infrastructure, I'm not talking about George Liu Netherlands type infrastructure, but better infrastructure, let's call it, in Paris, was something that back in December was really the safety valve that enabled people to get around the city by bicycle when we had these massive strikes. And then again, when we had the COVID lockdowns and the climb out of COVID. So creating a welcoming environment for light mobility is essential. And that light environment can be infrastructure, but it's not only infrastructure. A lot of it's speed management. If you put in place an effective way to manage speeds on a large part of the network in dense urban areas to 30 kilometers or even 20 kilometers per hour, that welcomes people. That welcomes people like Heather, that welcomes people like myself to use these areas because they feel that the risk of having a crash is lower and the consequences of having a crash are much lower. So the preconditions will set really what then will happen. And then there's this aspect of, oh, it's overcast today and or there are hills. Well, I think Heather nailed it. You get used to walking around. How many people don't walk in the rain? Okay, we use an umbrella, we dress for the rain, but very few people don't systematically do not walk in the rain. It's the same for cycling in places where there's a lot of cycling. It's the same for scootering as well. There's some design issues with scooters that make them a little bit unsafe in wet conditions. Hills, well, when we look at most of the bicycle sales, at least in Europe now, or the fastest rising sector of bicycle sales in Europe, they're e-bikes. And if anything, that has flattened cities. But it's not the only way to flatten cities by using technology. Clever routing, like in Lisbon, where the bicycle routes that are suggested either by hard signage or in-app shows the ways around the city that never go higher than 3% grade. So you can get around the city with the right knowledge, and that knowledge is something that can be provided by either technology or by simple signage that allows you to flatten the hills. There are very few areas where hills create a real barrier to the long-term development of cycling, and even in those areas, the rise of e-mobility has removed that. Even before e-bikes, I was surprised to look at the level of bicycle usage in Graz, Austria, which is flat center, hilly sides. It's about 8 to 9%. That's fairly high for a European city where there's not a whole lot of infrastructure. And it's certainly higher than a lot of flat cities that haven't put in place any kind of welcoming measures. So there are ways around these. The answer is I do not see structural barriers to behavior change. What I do see is that there have to be some preconditions in assisting and facilitating actions that public authorities can put into place that make that behavior change easier, that facilitates that change and makes it more durable.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I'd like to tag on that idea of catering for this experience of cycling, right? And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the rain, the sun, too hot, too cold, some hills. And I'd like to change the framework a bit and say that the experience of cycling, or this exposure to the environment, is one of the qualities that makes cycling so unique and different, from automobiles and the use of public transport, and that this exposure to the environment is, in most cases, something to be valued, right? And Phillippe talked about the value of physical exercise, and that is something that we should be designing so that people are able to enjoy. And the second point I want to touch on, also Phillippe mentioned, is that this return on investment, right? And this return on investment for cycling, much of it has to do with this physical activity element. Much of it has to do with making better places in cities, and we have to keep in mind that automobile infrastructure, public transit infrastructure, the capital costs of that, incredibly expensive, right? Even compared to the best of bicycle infrastructure, we're looking still at like a 0 or 2 more zeros at the end. And for the bicycle infrastructure, if we're talking about tactical urbanism measures or temporary bike lanes, it's the capital cost is free. So I want to emphasize that again, it's more of the political will and trying to get the will to reallocate that road space. That's the biggest barrier. And then the cost, in most city budgets and most provincial state level budgets, it's less than 1% dedicated to bicycle infrastructure, and in some cases 0.1%. So it's very a small piece of the pie, but we can get a lot done even with that small piece. And imagine the world we can make, you know, if we had 5, 10%, you know, and 50% of that budget and of the space. And we can definitely do much more with cycling infrastructure and with pedestrian infrastructure per dollar, you know, per euro, than we can with any other mode of transport, plus all the health and environmental benefits of that.
So with that note, I would like to ask the many hundreds of people who are attending this webinar, we would like to run a short online poll and to ask if following the corona pandemic, will you be using your bicycle or using bicycle at all more often than you used to before? You can now vote on the right hand of the screen, yes or no, and we'll just take a few more seconds so everyone can participate. The question is, if following the current coronavirus pandemic, will you be using bicycle more than you used to in the past? And I see that according to our unscientific poll, 61% of you are more likely to use the bicycle more often than they used to before, while 39 said yes. So with that somewhat optimistic note, I would like to ask our guests again the same question. If you could pick up one or two things or actions that, in your opinion, would be keeping the bicycle momentum a year from now, or even 5 years from now, what would it be? And if you think that what we're seeing now is temporary emergency measures to an emergency situation, or is it actually the tipping point towards more bicycle use globally? So Julie Anne, perhaps we'll start with you.
Well, in New Zealand, as in other parts of the world, we're also seeing just record numbers of bike sales and e-bike sales, and it's massively outstripping cars now in terms of imports. So I think this is the COVID-19 situation has accelerated a trend that was going to happen anyway because of climate change, because of what people want out of towns and cities, because of a desire for people to be more active. I think that inevitably bicycles make a lot of sense for short urban trips, and they just needed to be given the space. So I'm hopeful that this is going to accelerate a trend that was happening anyway, and that within a year, we'll be seeing even more demand for reprioritizing road space, for the speed changes, for actually treating bicycles as a serious urban mode of transport, because there's going to be so much demand coming from all these bicycle owners and e-bike owners.
Thank you. Heather, very shortly, because we also want to have everyone answer, but we also would like to take some questions from the audience. So very short.
Sure. Yeah, I think here too, it's a momentum that started before COVID. In many cities in Germany, we had Radentscheid, which was basically a referendum saying that we need to have more bicycle infrastructure in urban areas. And that was not just in the big cities, but also little cities. So we're already seeing a push. Come on, we want space for bikes on the road. And that has just been pushed forward really fast. It was a little turbojet on the bicycle infrastructure movement. And I think that's going to keep going. I mean, why not? It's a great difference that we're seeing. People are enjoying it. People will have their bikes now that they've bought their new e-bike or cargo bike or the trailer for their kids, and they've had a taste. That's normally the hardest thing, is getting started on something. Once you've tried it, then you're more likely to continue doing that. That's been done. So I think all we need to do is make sure that we market, brand, provide infrastructure, both the little aspects like the garbages that are tilted and the places to rest, but the big aspects too, nice pavement to ride on, wide enough infrastructure. Keep going on that.
Philip, your opinion on the near future of the bicycle use?
I'm just going to point out that back in the 1970s, we had a similar tipping point with the oil crisis. And of all of the countries represented here, only the one that George is in is the one that took advantage of that to make a long-term trajectory change. So is it a tipping point? I'm not sure. It's a big shove, that's for sure. For it to be a tipping point, there has to be action to lock in the changes that we're seeing right now. And that lock-in is going to require some political commitment at the local level and the national level. If that doesn't happen, then I'm afraid that it may not be a tipping point. The benefits are clear. The benefits should be linked to resilience, not to COVID-19, because COVID-19 is one of many possible shocks. And if cities can deliver that political commitment to build more resilient cities by allocating space more efficiently, then I think it will be a tipping point. But we have been there before, and only the Dutch seem to have pulled their hat out of, they pulled their feather out, well, that last time. So let's all be like the Dutch this time around.
George, please.
In 1970s and all that time, we've only gotten to 27% cycling mode share, and 27% is not a cycling utopia by any means. It's still an auto utopia. So I'd like to remind you of that. And I think the big takeaway of this conversation, what we've all had in common was this amazing openness to how cities and streets have opened their environments to new experiences, right? Children playing on the street, hearing the birds sing, kids being able to go out and ride and walk alone. And that safety and that new environment, I think will linger in people's memories for a while. And, you know, it's not about the money. It's not really about the infrastructure spending when it comes to the political and advocacy level. It is about having this, you know, having seen this completely different world happen in front of your eyes, on your own street, in front of your house, that I think hopefully we should hold on to before people forget. And as Phillippe said, and as Heather said, try to make this thing more permanent and lasting as we start to lose memory. Hopefully not, but, you know, let's keep it going.
Great. So now we have a couple of more minutes to answer some of the many questions that we received over the past hour. So if I could just see the first question, please. We have a question from Dr. Hassan Tayeb from Saudi Arabia. He's asking, cycling infrastructure in Saudi Arabia is very poor. I'm trying for the last 2 years to encourage the municipalities to move on and build that infrastructure, but people always say the weather is hot and the fuel is so cheap, so we use cars and no need for bikes. Phillippe, do you have any answer for that? Because you addressed already the weather conditions.
Absolutely. Of course, I have cycled in the Middle East, not in Saudi Arabia, in United Arab Emirates, in Oman, and Qatar. And I can attest that the situation at midday can be brutal. But I also know from those countries, like in many other countries in the world, there is a huge health problem linked to inactivity. And I think when you address what are the benefits of cycling, it's not just moving people around, it's people moving, just plain. And I think that is one angle that is worth pointing out, that an investment in this kind of light individual transport infrastructure that can be used in the morning, in the evening in these countries when people are going to and from work, provides an amount of physical activity that many in these populations simply do not have. And when we look at the benefits of cycling, when we count in the physical activity benefits, the economic benefits are tremendous and outweigh the negative impacts of exposure to crashes and unsafety almost by 20 to 1. So keep in mind that cycling is not just about getting around, it's about moving. And moving has a huge benefit for society.
Thank you. Next question from Sujid Modi. He's asking, and I think, Julie Anne, this could be a question for you. In low and medium income countries, governments are more focused on creating infrastructure for a private mode or for public transport rather than to non-motorized modes of transport. Do you think the governments need to change their approach towards non-motorized vehicle infrastructure?
I would certainly recommend it. I think that the push for vehicle-oriented infrastructure or public transport comes from the more developed, richer countries in the West, and we sort of made a terrible mistake and ended up with congestion and inactivity and a really, really expensive transportation system, but also the science of transportation engineering has really predominantly overlooked short trips, walking and cycling until recently haven't been picked up in most traffic modeling. So it's just not taken seriously when in fact it has an incredibly important role to play and needs to be more of a priority. And it makes so much sense in places where not everyone has the income to access a private vehicle, and where people might not have driver's licenses, to enable this form of transportation to be safe on a bicycle or on foot, which is accessible to almost everyone, especially with e-bikes now.
Thank you. A question from member of the audience named Marco. Instead of focusing on making cycling more attractive, shouldn't we focus on making driving less attractive? Heather, perhaps that is a question for you regarding behavior on the roads.
It's a super point, of course. Like I mentioned before, we need push measures just as much as we need pull measures. They need to work together to get the people out of their cars and onto the bike lanes. And maybe it will happen as a byproduct of creating more bike lanes, having more space for cyclists and pedestrians, and less space for cars, less space for parking, less space for driving someone somewhere and leaving them there. You know, it's very important. Yep, for sure. We can't forget that part at all.
I think we can just, if I can add, I think we've seen cities take that route, and by putting in place cordon pricing like London has, or by reallocating space away from cars like Paris has, it has been this push measure that Heather has talked about. And I think that is inevitable. You have to orient the space to be used in the way that is most efficient from all city users. And that includes inhabitants, and that includes not just for transport use. Includes for occupying cafe terraces, etc. So those are some choices that require some push measures.
Okay, we have one more question here from Chaba Kellen. How do you change the battlefield that is often so antagonistic between cyclists and car drivers, and how can you improve collaborative behavior between road users? Actually, it's a question for all of you, so if anyone wants to answer it.
Antagonism. Well, I think I'll take a crack at it, and I think antagonism is an interesting word to be used here, right? And when I look at urban space and the work we've done at the Urban Cycling Institute, we're indeed trying to figure out how do we help people work out the different modes and the different ways they get around on urban space. And in fact, when we looked at how people move by filming intersections or just observing the streetscape, we see that people have a remarkable ability to negotiate with each other, right? At walking speeds, at cycling speeds. And we find that people lose that ability to negotiate with each other, right? When you're in a metal box going at 50, 60 kilometers an hour on an urban road. So I think this antagonism happens because we're losing that ability to see each other, to interact with each other on the street level, and then it's being played out on a larger policy level through like this battle of funding, this battle of infrastructure, when in reality, if we can just work out how we get around at intersections, at the street level, and look each other in the eye. We don't need complicated traffic lights or road signs. All that is for this automobile and larger vehicle infrastructure that doesn't inherently need to be within our city centers.
Yeah, Heather, please, and then Philip.
Maybe just one add-on to that.
Very shortly, please, because we are almost out of time.
Sorry, I think when you're a car driver and you've been on a bicycle before, you're automatically more inclined to see the sight of the bicycle user. Yeah. Say, okay, this maybe they feel dangerous when I do this move or drive too fast, or it's just automatically there that you can see out of the perspective of the other person more.
And so that's the requirement for school education programs where all people have been cyclists at one point and trained as such.
Very good. So with this optimism, I think we are nearing the end of the webinar. First, I would like to thank our 4 guests today for their very interesting insights. And I would like to thank the hundreds of people that joined us from, I think, all over the world. I would like to remind you that if we didn't manage to answer the questions that you sent over the last hour, then we will make an effort to answer all of the questions later on by email. And for those of you who want to join our next webinar, that's happening on the 16th of June, that's next week, and it will focus on how cities can fight pollution from transportation, and how they actually can win the fight quite quickly, quicker than most of us think. So from all of us here in Karlsruhe, Germany, I would like to thank everyone again and see you at the next Shaping Mobility webinar. Thank you.